The movie starts with the introduction of a man who has been eating chicken all his life, but one day he comes across a horrible truth. A woman serves him some chicken, and since the man is extremely hungry, he eats it without any questions and spits out the bones. But as he stares at the bones, he notices some patterns, so he tries to assemble them together. Shockingly, the bones make up a human hand, and its shape looks eerily familiar. When the man stares for a while, he notices that the middle finger is slightly bent, just like that of his son. It appears as if the man has eaten his own son's hand. Oh boy, been there. The man's name is Mark, and he is the CEO of a large company. Mark has a very successful career now, but when he was a child, he was often beaten up by his violent father. Therefore, since Mark established his own company, he has never again visited his hometown in Kentucky. But one day, when he gets the news that his father has died, he becomes slightly upset. Mark hated his father, and he doesn't want to go back to his hometown. But when his wife, Viora, suggests they all visit Kentucky to pay their final respects, he reluctantly agrees. The next day, the couple and their 2 children, Samsara and Tyden, fly to Appalachia, Kentucky on a small private plane. Mark himself flies the plane, showing that he has come a long way since he escaped his abusive father. On the way to their destination, the family stops at a gas station to refuel. When Mark goes inside the store, he notices some mysterious things, like human skulls, preserved animals, and insects for sale, most likely for black magic. This reminds Mark of his dark and ignorant childhood, so he rolls his eyes and walks up to the counter with a bag of chips. There, he notices the store owner sewing a mojo bag. Curious, he asks the store owner about it, and the latter replies that mojo bags can protect someone from black magic. He also suggests the family take some with them, but Mark, being an atheist, dismisses the theory as superstition and leaves. The family then continue to their final destination, and when Mark asks his children about the trip so far, they insult the place, making fun of the local black people. This infuriates Viora, and she gets into a verbal argument with Mark. Viora feels that Mark enables their behavior by not disciplining them. However, Mark quickly responds that he will never be like his abusive black father. After a while, it suddenly begins to rain, causing the plane to shudder violently. Mark tries his best to get them out of the situation, but the winds are so strong that he eventually loses control and crashes. The screen then blacks out, and Mark wakes up later with bruises all over his body in an unfamiliar room. He takes a look around and realizes that he is in the attic of someone's farmhouse. Suddenly, the homeowner, Miss Eloise, appears and tries to get him back on the bed, but Mark resists and asks her about his family. Miss Eloise, who is very strict and particular about everything, quickly calls up her husband Earl and their giant son, Lewis. The 3 of them then try to calm Mark down, but when he tries to run away, Lewis picks him up and throws him on the bed like a rag doll. After this, Earl informs Mark that his plane crashed yesterday, and that he was alone. Expectedly, Mark refuses to believe that and continues to insist on finding his family. He again tries to escape, but just then, Miss Eloise blows a strange powder over his face, which makes him fall asleep. This implies that the family is not an ordinary one, and they possess some magical powers. Either that, or ketamine. Later, Miss Eloise is seen making Mark's voodoo doll, which she refers to as a boogity doll. She explains that she wants to nurse Mark back to health using this doll. After finishing up, she places the boogity doll by the window and secures the window with a white powder to keep the devil away. After she leaves, Mark starts looking for a way to escape. He realizes that the door is locked, so he sneaks out of the window and onto the roof. He then jumps from one roof to another as it rains heavily. He eventually reaches the barn, where Miss Eloise has gathered with several other villagers. Here, it is revealed that Miss Eloise is a healer who uses her voodoo powers to cure people of their sickness. After a while, the ceremony commences, and Earl informs everyone that today, his wife, Miss Eloise, is going to use animal parts for her root work, but on the day of the blood moon, she is going to do something much bigger. Then the treatment begins. Earl cuts a cat's tongue and puts it in Miss Eloise's mute patient's boogity doll. She then reads some spells, and shockingly, the mute patient starts speaking as the crowd erupts in cheers. Mark watches it all unfold from a large peephole on the roof. Following this, Eloise moves on to her blind patient named Julius. She places a goat's eyes in Julius's eye sockets, and begins chanting some spells. Lo and behold, Julius regains his eyesight and immediately points at Mark, who is peeking from the roof. Terrified, Mark quickly ducks, but Miss Eloise and her family rush to the attic to inspect. They eventually find him inside the room, but notice the open window and Mark's soaking wet body. Miss Eloise can tell that he had stepped out of his room. However, she lets it slide and asks him what he thought of her abilities. Expectedly, Mark doesn't believe in her methods, and instead, he compares her to his superstitious his father. He feels that her treatments are psychosomatic, which is a theory that if somebody believes in something desperately, it will physically become true. Miss Eloise is offended, and she poignantly retorts that people from her village believe in these treatments because they don't have access to good health care. Plus, those goat's eyes obviously did the trick. She then locks the window and door before leaving him alone. The next day, Mark wakes up to find a plate full of meat. He enjoys the dish prepared by Miss Eloise before apologizing to her for being rude the other day. She forgives him and goes to the kitchen to fetch Mark another plate, leaving the attic door open. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Mark quickly takes out the bell attached to the door so that it doesn't make noise when he tries to escape. After he finishes the food, Miss Eloise brings out some bones, explaining that they can tell one's future. She claims that these bones are telling her that on the day of the blood moon, Mark will get all the poison out of his body and meet his family. She then instructs him to throw the bones on the bed to learn more about his future. However, he refuses to participate, and Miss Eloise comments that Mark is just like her son Louis before she got him straight. After Miss Eloise leaves him with the bones, Mark becomes bored and starts assembling them. But to his horror, he realizes that it's a human hand. Moreover, it appears to be his son Tiden's hand, as it too has a broken middle finger. Because of the revelation, a terrified Mark throws up everything he consumed. He then uses his lock-picking skills to unlock the door and sneak out of the room. With his injured feet, Mark drags himself downstairs, but before he can escape, Miss Eloise's pet crow alerts her, prompting him to hide. She rushes to the attic to check up on her prisoner, but by that time, Mark has already escaped to the house. He runs into the woods and comes across the debris of the crashed plane. Inside, he sees the blood of his family, but no dead bodies. Mark then notices a hut nearby, but before he can investigate, he collapses on the ground from exhaustion. The next day, he again wakes up in Miss Eloise's attic and notices her leaving for the market with Earl from the window. Mark then removes the dressing from his feet, and to his horror, he finds a metal spike shoved there by Miss Eloise to keep him from healing and running away. With no other choice, he summons all his strength and courage to pull the nail out. He also tries his best to keep himself from screaming so that no one can sense his escape. After the painful ordeal, Mark again ventures out and notices 3 newly filled graves. Fearing they could belong to his wife and children, he frantically digs the grave. But it turns out that they're just the graves of sacrificed animals. Relieved, Mark heads to the barn where he finds a basement. Upon inspection, he comes across some of Miss Eloise's dark magic books and desecrated dead bodies. He goes through her books and learns that she is preparing him for the blood moon day for the Transference of Life spell. For this spell, a person's life is sacrificed to mend someone else's injuries. Although Mark is terrified, he soon regains his composure and turns the tables by using the magic books to make a new Boogity doll for Miss Eloise. Shortly after, as he proceeds to return back to the room, he hears the sound of a phone ringing, and after some searching, eventually finds it. Mark then takes the phone back to his room but forgets to close the main door. When Miss Eloise returns, she notices the door and suspects that Mark has managed to get out once again. She immediately orders Louis to fetch the axe and rushes to the attic. Mark hears the approaching footsteps, so he reluctantly puts the spike back in his foot, which makes him wail in pain. After a while, the voodoo woman arrives. Fortunately, after inspecting his dressing, she doesn't find anything suspicious, so she lets him be. After she leaves, Mark calls 911, and a local policeman picks it up. Surprisingly, the cop reveals that his family came to the police station a week ago and reported him and Tiden missing. Mark controls his emotions and tells the officer that he has been held hostage by a certain Miss Eloise and Earl. The policeman recognizes the couple and promises to get there as soon as possible. A while later, he arrives outside the farmhouse and talks to Miss Eloise, while Mark removes the spike from his foot again. Unfortunately, this only enrages the woman, so she storms into the attic to punish Mark. She grabs his Boogity doll and slams him on the bed. After this, she makes him lose his voice and wraps a thread around the Boogity, effectively tying the real Mark up. After she leaves to meet the officer, Mark hops to the window, but he is unable to utter a word and alert the cop. Refusing to give up, Mark grabs the Boogity doll and hops downstairs, but by then, the policeman is already left. Despite this, he slowly follows the cop and eventually catches up to him. After putting a thread in the Boogity's mouth, Mark also gets his voice back. He then explains everything to the cop and asks him to drive away, but just when they reach a bit further, Mark realizes that the cop is friends with the voodoo couple, and he has again taken him back to the doomed house. It's a blood moon, and Mark is then dragged into the barn, where the villagers have gathered to witness his sacrifice. Viora, Samsara, and Tiden are also brought into the barn, much to Mark's shock. On one hand, he is relieved to see Tiden and the rest of his family alive, but they're unusually calm and quiet, seemingly under Miss Miss Eloise's spell. After the ceremony begins, Miss Eloise blows her magic dust on Mark, making him fall asleep. He is then laid on the table as the villagers cheer with excitement. Miss Eloise plans to replace Earl's diseased heart with Mark's, so she proceeds to make an incision on his chest with a dagger. But suddenly, Mark wakes up, takes out the spike from his foot, and stabs Earl right through the heart, much to everyone's horror. He then gets up from the table, causing all the people, including Miss Eloise, to run out in fear. It turns out Mark had earlier replaced Miss Eloise's magic dust with something else, and therefore it didn't work. After the coast is clear, Mark approaches his family and uses the original magic dust on them. They soon come back to their real selves, but Mark is devastated to learn that Titan's hand has really been amputated. Next, Mark ambushes the policeman and steals his car. However, instead of leaving with his family, he returns to the barn. Meanwhile, Miss Eloise and the other villagers return with the giant, Lewis, and the latter storms into the barn to kill Mark. The two engage in a brutal fight, but Lewis easily gets the upper hand. But suddenly, he starts gasping for air and pukes a lot of water before dropping dead. To everyone's astonishment, Mark had drowned Lewis's Boogity doll. Furious, Miss Eloise screams and confronts him. She admits that he was smart for drowning Lewis's Boogity doll, but he can't do the same to her as she has hidden hers really well. She then proceeds to stab him, but Mark blows the magic dust over her face, causing her to freeze instantly. Surprisingly, he brings out her Boogity doll that he had made earlier and hammers it, sending the real Miss Eloise flying. The old woman's body knocks over a wooden pillar and the barn catches fire. Before leaving, Mark places some white powder on the door, which can supposedly keep the evil out. And since Miss Eloise is no less than a devil herself, she fails to cross the line, hence trapping her inside the fire. The other locals quickly confront Mark, but he threatens to use their Boogity dolls and makes them retreat. As the fire engulfs the barn, Mark returns to his family, and together they drive away from the village. The movie ends as Miss Eloise's original Boogity doll is shown in the basement, which appears to be completely fine. I don't quite understand the point of the racism at the beginning of this movie, but otherwise, that was awesome. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.